But I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank you for your interest. I want to thank you for your passion and for your commitment to strengthening our food system, to ensuring that people have access to healthy foods, to supporting our farmers, to doing so many things that I think are so vital. And I want to thank Danny for all of her work, and I am grateful that Food Tank is doing their summit here at the Tufts Friedman School. I have a great admiration for Tufts, and I have learned so much from their professors and from their students and from their researchers. And what I love about this school is its mission. It's not just about kind of talking the talk, it's also walking the walk. It's trying to find solutions and not just issuing academic papers. So I'm thrilled to be here. I kind of feel as I'm a little bit inadequate because I was looking at the panelists. We just heard from Jody Adams, and you have heard kind of from the best of the best, the experts on food policy. And I'm kind of like the least informed, qualified person you're going to hear from. So it's usually last but not least. I think in this case it's last and least that you're getting here from me. But let me just tell you this. I'm here. I'm not a physician. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a farmer. I'm not a chef. I don't run a food bank. I head no nonprofit agency to deal with our food policy. I'm here as a politician who knows that these issues that you talked about here today are incredibly important. I'm also here as a politician who is, quite frankly, ashamed that in the richest, most powerful country in the history of the world, that we have 42 million people who are food insecure and who are hungry. I'm also here as a politician who believes that hunger is a political condition. I mean, there's lots of things that you are all working on in this audience to help deal with the issue of food insecurity, nutrition, and hunger. But quite frankly, in Washington, the political will doesn't exist. We have the solutions. We know what to do. I mean, I wish if somebody asked me, how do you end all wars in the world? I'm not quite sure I would have the answers. Or how can you end all prejudice and racism in the world? I have some ideas, but I don't know if I have the definitive solution. But we know how to end hunger. I mean, we know what it takes. We have the resources, we have the food, we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have everything, but we don't have the political will. And when we talk about these issues in Washington, it's always very disjointed because this issue doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of just one committee. And it doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of just one agency in the executive branch. There's bits and pieces all over the place. So there's nobody who wakes up every day and says, how are we going to end hunger in America? Or how are we going to end hunger around the globe? And I think that's a problem. So over the years, I've asked for hunger czars. I tried for 8 years to get President Obama to host a White House conference on food, nutrition, and hunger. Couldn't do it. There were so many other issues out there that were competing with the attention of the White House. Couldn't get them to focus on this. And I was a little bit upset about that because when he ran for president for the first time, I was asked to go to Iowa, this is when he was a candidate running for the first time, to announce that if he became president, childhood hunger in America would be ended by 2015. Well, it's now 2017. We haven't done it. Now, I love President Obama, don't get me wrong. I'm a big supporter, and they did lots of stuff to help provide relief to people who were struggling. But the bottom line is that this should be front and center on our agenda. And as you heard from speakers all day today, this issue of hunger and food insecurity and lack of access to nutritious food, it has implications, in so many other areas. I mean, I wish when we debated the Affordable Care Act 8 years ago that we actually talked about nutrition, that we emphasized that should have been a priority. I mean, my grandmother used to say to me all the time growing up, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. I wish she was still alive so I could tell her she was right. But the bottom line is food is medicine. Doctors, before they become doctors, they ought to spend more time in nutrition classes. Doctors, they can prescribe pills and pharmaceuticals. They ought to be able to prescribe food to people. Because the bottom line is that if we want to prevent diseases, nutrition is the key. Not everybody, we could prevent diabetes, we can prevent high blood pressure, we can prevent, heart disease and obesity if we get this right. And we got to understand that to get it right, we need to start early. And that's where our schools come into play. We ought to have in our curriculum, and it doesn't have to be a separate course, but we have to integrate nutrition more with the curriculum that's currently being taught. We need to teach kids early. There's that old saying, it's tough to teach an old dog new tricks. It's true. If you grow up, and I did, on not a particularly nutritious diet, it's hard to change. But you get the kids early on, and they develop patterns that will last with them for the rest of their lifetime. And we have to know our audience. I remember, shortly after getting elected to Congress, I visited a school when my district used to go down to the southeastern part of the state, down in the Fall River area. And I had with me George McGovern, no relation, but I work for him and I love him. And he and Bob Dole did so much to try to promote nutrition around this country and around the world. But we went to it was a second or third grade class, and the guy who was in charge of nutrition at this particular school didn't seem to me to be particularly well qualified. But nonetheless, we were sitting there as they were giving these kids their school lunch. It was the sloppiest sloppy Joe I've ever seen. It looked like it was an oil slick. It had a rainbow in it, in the grease that was coming out of the sandwich, soggy French fries, and an apple. And this guy was telling us, see, these kids, they won't eat the apple. They won't eat the apple. They'll eat the junk. They won't eat the apple. What am I going to do? George McGovern said, do you have a knife? Gave him a knife, and he cut the apple up into pieces, and he walked it around, and all the kids ate the apple. And the guy said, well, geez, I'm amazed, He said, well, you shouldn't be, because these kids are losing some of their teeth. So it hurts when they bite in the apple. So you got to know your audience. And so when you're in second or third grade and still losing some of your teeth, you ought to have an apple cut up and you'll eat it. We have these nutritional standards in the school lunch and school meal programs now, thanks to the First Lady, Michelle Obama, that now are under attack. They want to reverse them. I don't know why anybody in their right mind would want to reverse nutritional standards on school feeding, but nonetheless, we're dealing with a Congress that wants to do that. And people will say to me, well, they won't eat the apples. They throw them away. So I've actually visited schools. I've had members of the school boards come up to me and tell me that they don't like these standards because kids won't eat the apples. So I went, I've been visiting some of these schools, and I asked the students, I said, how many of you like apples? Everybody raises their hand. How many don't? Maybe one or two kids raise their hand. Why aren't you eating the apples? He says, because by the time I get through the line, I got about 10 minutes to eat my lunch. And I could breathe down a sandwich. I could maybe take a bite out of the apple, but they won't let me bring it to class because it's too noisy. And so I take one bite and I throw it away. If you give me another 5 minutes or another 3 minutes, I can eat the apple. These are the kinds of things that are so obvious and yet become obstacles to kind of promoting the kind of nutrition that we all think is so important. I do a lot of work on the issue of SNAP. My critique of the SNAP program is that the benefit is inadequate. It is not enough. I'm sorry, I don't care how you want to slice or dice it. The average benefit is about $1.40 per person per meal. I can't buy a cup of coffee for that. All right, so that is the average SNAP budget, and so that's why people on SNAP end up at food banks and food pantries at the end of the month, because it doesn't last. And the choices they have oftentimes are limited. If you want people to be able to make healthier choices, rather than saying you can't buy this and you can't buy that, and I'm going to micromanage what you can do with your SNAP dollars, maybe the better thing to do is increase the benefits so people can make those choices, or or provide more support for initiatives that allow you to get double the worth out of your SNAP dollar. If you buy nutritious food. These are the kinds of things that we ought to be talking about in Washington. And we should be talking about it because it's the right thing to do, because it promotes good health, And that means that people will have less suffering, which again should be a good thing that politicians want to do in Washington. But if you don't care about that, you should do it because you're cheaper if you're healthier. You know, there's less. We can avoid hospital stays and other kinds of health problems that you may have that, quite frankly, could last with you for a whole lifetime and will be very, very expensive. So right now in Washington, we're about to start debating the next farm bill. A lot of the focus is on this issue of how we find savings. And, once again, the same old people are going back to the same old tired rhetoric about looking at SNAP as an ATM machine to pay for everything else. It would be immoral to cut this program. It would be immoral to change the structure of this program. It would be immoral to stop putting more work requirements and hurdles in place. There's a new buzzword in D.C., block grants are the words that you're hearing a lot of right now. Let the states decide what to do with the money. We'll put a hard limit on what we give and let the states decide. Well, the bottom line is, you know as well as I do, if we block grant SNAP, that will be used for other things besides making sure people have enough to eat. And the other new thing that we're talking about in D.C. now is they want to go after these people called ABODs, able-bodied adults without dependents, because they must be really lazy, because, they're not working and, they're entitled to SNAP for 3 months, and if they don't have a job or not a worker training program, they lose it for 3 years. We have people saying, why should they even have 3 months? Well, here's the deal. Why should we be putting these restrictions, arbitrary restrictions on these people to begin with? I mean, the able-bodied adult without dependent population is complicated. There are veterans who are just returning, who are having trouble reintegrating back into their communities. They fall in that population. You have people who are homeless. You have people who live in rural areas who don't have transportation to a job or do not have access to a job training program. You have people with undiagnosed mental illnesses that are in that category. But the bottom line is, what the hell is Congress doing going after programs to make those people's lives more miserable? That's not what our job is supposed to be. We're supposed to help people, not hurt people. And I'm going to just say one thing to you here. This will come as a shock to some of you, but intelligence is not necessarily a prerequisite for serving in Congress. And apparently it's not a prerequisite for serving as president either. But the deal, what I have come to learn, being on the Agriculture Committee, is that people can serve in Congress and literally be in a kind of an alternative universe. I mean, you can get elected to Congress and never, ever, ever walk into a food bank. You could be elected to Congress and never sit down and talk to anybody on SNAP. You could be in Congress and never talk to anybody on WIC. You could be in Congress and not even know what the average SNAP benefit is. Because I always ask it's kind of a yearly quiz I give to everybody, like, what is the average benefit? Figuring that they'll know. And usually people say it's enough or adequate. They don't know. And we're the committee in charge of oversight. But the bottom line is there is this disconnect. And there is a narrative in Washington that when it comes to people who are hungry, we're talking about people who somehow want to be hungry. They don't want to work. They want a handout. Bottom line is, the majority of people who are on our nutrition programs, and on SNAP in particular, are kids, are senior citizens, are people who are disabled. Of those who can work, the majority work. So the question should be, why is it that you're working and you're not making a livable wage? I mean, if we're going to have all these work requirements put into place, I mean, you ought to be guaranteed a wage to get you out of poverty. So, look, I mean, you've been here a long time, and I don't want to go on and on and on and on, but there's so many things that we need to do. But first and foremost, we need to fight to protect this social safety net. I had hoped that the election would have turned out differently and that we would be talking about sewing up the holes in our social safety net. Now we are in the battle of our lives to protect these programs that basically provide food and nutrition to people at risk. And this is going to be a battle. There is no question about it. This is going to be a battle. because, again, the narrative in Washington doesn't reflect the reality back at home. And this is where I think this is a time when we all need to kind of reevaluate what our lobbying techniques are. And I know some people can't lobby, based on, your whatever your status is, whatever. But I'm saying our powers of persuasion need to change. They need to be more aggressive. We need, quite frankly, to be in the face of more and more of our politicians at every level of government. We cannot let them undo the nutrition and food programs that literally keep people alive in this country. I met with a group of faith-based leaders about a week and a half ago. There were nuns and priests and rabbis and ministers, and they had talked to me about visiting a member of Congress who had a particularly bad record on these issues. And I said, well, how'd the meeting go? Oh, wonderful. I said, really? I said, what did he say? He says, we don't want anybody to be hungry, and my wife and I give money to charities all the time. We give at our church, and I said, well, what did you say? We said, well, we're going to pray for you, and God bless you, and out the door they went. I said, here's the deal. It's okay if you say to them, go to hell. I mean, it really is. I mean, because the bottom line is on these issues, I don't want anybody's empathy or sympathy. I want their vote, and it doesn't do anybody any good if they're voting to cut these programs. The last farm bill in the House, they voted to cut the SNAP program by $40 billion. And then we had a debate over whether we should drug test everybody on SNAP. And I got on the floor and I said, you know what, maybe we got to drug test members of Congress. Because that might explain why we're having this debate, right? But here's a little interesting footnote to that story. The guy I was fighting with, 2 weeks later, got caught up in a drug bust. So he was, but this demonization of people struggling in poverty has to stop. It just does. And we need to get back to the viewpoint where where there's such a thing as the common good. And the bottom line is if we can get this right, and by getting it right, it's not only supporting these programs. I mean, I could be here all day, but talking about the importance of supporting our farmers. They need to get paid a livable wage, a decent wage for what they do. I mean, I grew up in the city. I spent a lot of time on farms now. I would last 10 minutes on a farm. I mean, they work awfully hard. They deserve a lot more than they get. And so we need to support our farmers, and we need to make sure that in terms of what Washington does, that there's some help there as well. I'll just close with this. There's a lot of talk in Washington right now about national security. I mean, if you saw the president's budget, I mean, everything gets decimated, including a lot of important programs to help feed hungry people all around the world, like the McGovern-Dole bill, which I authored, not named after me, it's named after George McGovern and Bob Dole, but it's a school feeding program. They zeroed it out. But the president says that we're all interested in national security. Well, here's what I wish we would do. We need to redefine national security. It needs to mean more than the number of weapons we have in our nuclear arsenal. It needs to include things like jobs. It needs to include things like making sure people have enough to eat. It needs to make sure that people have places to live, they have shelter, that they have opportunities in a future. Because I'll tell you, most of the people that I meet with in my district, they don't lose sleep at night, worried about whether Osama bin Laden's, second cousin is going to knock through their front door. But they do worry about what happens if they lose a job. They worry about whether their kids are going to, if they don't get a job, how they're going to eat, whether they're going to be able to afford a place to live. And, as I remind my colleagues in Washington on the issue of hunger, there is not a community in the United States, there is not a single congressional district in the United States that is hunger-free. This is a huge problem. And we have to start acting like it is a huge problem. And we need to be about solutions. So, I was hoping that somebody else was going to be president right now, and we would be talking about putting together a White House conference on food, nutrition, and hunger. I'm afraid, I'm afraid to give this administration that charge. But nonetheless, I mean, we ought to be thinking about bringing the, in much of the same kind of spirit in which all of you are gathered here today, but, actually building a summit, maybe here at Tufts, to do that, with that mission. I mean, let's give members of Congress, here's the plan. Here's what you got to do. You vote for these things, you increase money over here, you give more flexibility here, you do this, you do that, you support you become wind at the backs of some of the innovative projects that we heard about here today. We can end this problem. And I think that's, to me, that's what government should be all about. I mean, we should be taking on these big solutions. I give a speech every week on the House floor under the hashtag End Hunger Now. I've talked about Meals on Wheels, I've talked about child nutrition, I've talked about SNAP, I talk about incredible volunteer efforts, I talked about my visit to the Daily Table a few months ago. I mean, I talk about whatever, just so that my colleagues don't forget. It's constantly there. And somebody said to me, but do you think anybody's listening? Are you making a difference? And I said, well, one is we got to try. Because there are some fights worth having, and this is one of them. I also referred to them to, there was a great journalist from way back when who was, a guy who took on Joseph McCarthy and the CIA and all this other kind of stuff, a guy named I.F. Stone. Some of you may remember who he was, but I had the pleasure of meeting him shortly before he died many years ago. And somebody asked him, don't you get discouraged? I mean, with all that needs to be done, I mean, you don't seem to have a lot of, allies out there. Isn't it discouraging? And he was in his late 80s at the time, and he said, he says, my philosophy is this, if you urinate on a stone long enough, you'll make an indentation. And I kind of feel that that's what I do every week. And so we're going to make a difference. And I want everybody here to know. Look, you're our knowledge base. Those of you in this audience, those of you who are watching. I mean, you have the expertise. You have been on the ground locally, making things happen. Get that information to me. Get it to your members of Congress. Let us brag about the success stories. Let us talk about the solutions. Let us get this discussion, elevated to a new level. And I think if we can do that, we can end hunger now. So thank you very much for having me, and thanks for being here.